Welcome to today's session of Turn on Federalism. My name is Claudia Fackler, and I work for the Hans Seidel Foundation in Munich as project coordinator at the Institute for International Cooperation. We are co-organizing this event together with 50 Shades of Federalism. Our session today will focus on federalism in Sri Lanka. Please allow me to say a few words about Turn on Federalism, our partners, and about today's session before I hand over to our speakers. Our Turn on Federalism seminar is a cooperation between the Hans Seidel Foundation and 50 Shades of Federalism. The Hans Seidel Foundation is a German political foundation with a mandate of the German Federal Parliament. Our core task is to promote and support democracy and the rule of law within Germany, especially through civic education in Bavaria, but also through worldwide activities in more than 60 partner countries. The second partner is 50 Shades of Federalism, which is a website project established in 2017 by Søren Keil and Paul Anderson. 50 Shades of Federalism publishes short papers on different discussions on federalism. The papers are free to download and to read on the website 50shadesofFederalism.com. Our Turn on Federalism series today is event number 11, aims to discuss the 50 Shades of Federalism papers, to engage with experts, politicians, and civil society actors around the world in order to look at the possibilities of federalism, its different shades, and also its country-based evolutions. The idea is to create a network of cooperation and exchange. For further information, please visit our website. There you can find videos of all previous sessions and brief summaries of the events. Our topic today will focus on federalism in Sri Lanka. Federalism is broadly defined as a political system in which power is shared between a central government and state governments. However, federalism has come to mean two different things to Sri Lankans. We will look at the question how the concept of federalism has changed over time in the understanding of Sinhalese and Tamils of Sri Lanka. And we will also discuss how federalism has become such a contentious idea and so misinterpreted amongst these groups in this country. Please allow me to introduce our today's speaker. Our speaker is Rochelle Ganagasa-Bay. He's research manager in Sri Lanka. The event will be moderated by Thea Bechler. She's a scientific researcher at the Institute of Federalism at the University of Freiburg. If you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A box. We will collect your questions and pass them on to our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you will enjoy today's presentation. And without any further delay, please allow me to hand over to Rochelle Ganagasa-Bay. Rochelle, you have the word.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Claudia. Let me share my screen. We can get going. All right. Before I begin, I must acknowledge and thank Dr. Søren, Thea, Claudia, Shades of Federalism, and the Hans Seidel Foundation for actually giving me this opportunity. Let's dive straight into the presentation. I wrote the article, Federalism in Sri Lanka, One Concept, Two Conceptions, to really unpack and trace two aspects. First is to really trace the historic evolution of the current concept of federalism in Sri Lanka. And as you will see in the next sections, federalism as a concept was at one point in time championed either by the Singhalese or the Tamil community in the country. Second is to really unpack the concept or the conception of federalism itself. At present, we Sri Lankans seem to have two conceptions of the concept of federalism. The two conceptions really stems from the historic evolution of federalism itself. So today I will unpack these two sections from my article. Before I go into these two sections, let me give you all a quick snapshot on Sri Lanka. Perhaps most of you often associate Sri Lanka with cricket, Ceylon tea, and tourism. Today, let me give you a quick introduction to the socio-political dynamics of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a multi-ethnic and multi-religious country. As you can see from this slide, the majority of the country is populated by Sinhalese, followed by Sri Lankan Tamils and Sri Lankan Moors. We also have a significant population of hill country Tamils, known in the census as the Indian Tamils. In terms of religion, we are again multi-religious. We have four main religions in the country: Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. An interesting feature in Sri Lanka is that often the ethnic and religious identities are conflated. So we sometimes identify ourselves as Tamil Hindus or Sinhala Buddhists and so on. We also have Sinhala and Tamil as the official languages of the country, with English being a linked language. Historically, Sri Lanka boasts an extensive history. From the period of 1505 to 1948, Sri Lanka was colonized under three successive colonial powers: the Portuguese, the Dutch, and finally the British. In 1948, Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, gained independence from the British. And ever since we got independence, so the last 73 years after post-independence, Sri Lanka's history has been marred by a nearly 3-decade armed conflict, 2 insurrections, and several incidents of ethno-religious violence. Now, with this background in mind, let's dive straight into the first section. That is to really unpack the evolution of federalism. I will present my findings in 2 parts based on the political trajectories taken by the Singhalese and the Tamil-speaking communities. Let's start with the Sinhalese position on federalism. As you can see from this spectrum, in the past, it was the Singhalese who espoused the idea of federalism. But from there, the Singhalese seem to have moved their stance, and at present, they espouse a system outside of federalism. In tracing the Singhalese position, we can identify the major changes across 2 periods, really, pre-independence and post-independence. Before independence, it was the Singhalese who championed federalism. Under British rule, Sri Lanka's society was largely divided into 3 main regions and 3 main groups. We had the Tamils and Muslims in the north and east of the country, the upcountry Singhalese, who comprised mainly of the Kandyan nobility, and the low country Singhalese, who were from the maritime provinces. In such a situation, the upcountry Singhalese championed federalism. They wanted to establish a federal structure to really preserve the upcountry Singhalese dominance in politics and to gain some form of autonomy for themselves. At that time, there were several Singhalese leaders and groups that championed federalism. From among them, perhaps the 2 that had significant influence was SWRD Bandaranaike, who went on to become the 4th Prime Minister of the country, and the Kandyan National Assembly. Now, the Kandyan National Assembly, made up of the upcountry Singhalese nobility, actually appeared before the British Commission and proposed that Ceylon should be divided into 3 self-governing states under a central federal government. Similarly, SWR Bandaranaike promoted an internal federation, and that in Ceylon, each province should have complete autonomy. But the British actually rejected these calls and granted independence to Ceylon in 1948. In the 1940s and early 1950s, we saw a shift in the socio-political dynamics with the divisions between the upcountry Singhalese and the low country Singhalese community. The divisions were kind of fading away, and a common ethno-religious identity and an ethno-linguistic identity started to emerge in the form of a Sinhala Buddhist identity, and it started gaining some form of momentum. So the successive governments that came into power introduced policies along ethno-religious line, and these were seen as discriminatory by the Tamil-speaking communities. In 1956, for example, the SWRD Bandaranaike's government passed the Official Languages Act, known as the Sinhala Only Act, which made Sinhala the country's only official language by sidelining Tamil. At the same time, there were also several state-led Sinhalese colonization programs in the north and east. The Sinhalese governments actually saw these acts, the change in language, the expansion of colonies, as a correction of injustices faced by them under the British rule. Now, the Tamil-speaking community, on the other hand, strongly opposed the government's policies and started demanding autonomy in the form of federalism. Now, as a measure to appease the Tamils and then give them some form of devolution, the government sought to devolve power to the regions, including the north and east, which was mostly made up of the Tamil community. The 1957 Bandaranayake-Chelvanayagam Pact and the 1965 Senanayake-Chelvanayagam Pacts tried to really present these in a formal way. But these pacts were abandoned following heavy Sinhalese resistance to them. Now, the failure to accommodate Tamil demands really manifested into Tamil calls for separatism. To counter separatism, the government adopted two approaches. Militarily, the government engaged in combat with the Tamil militant groups, which eventually turned into a nearly 3-decade armed conflict that ended in 2009 with the defeat of the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. But what is perhaps more important and relevant for us today during this webinar is a second approach the government took to politically negotiate and provide limited or concessionary devolution as means to counter separatism. Perhaps the most notable among these measures was the 1987 Indolanka Accord, which sought to create provincial councils that provided limited devolution. The Indolanka Accords directly paved way for the 13th Amendment that really created this whole system of provincial councils. But certain aspects of the 13th Amendment, for example, land powers and police powers, still remain to be devolved. Since then, Sri Lankan governments at times have also promised to fully implement the 13th Amendment and go well beyond it as well, including the past two presidents, Mahinda Rajapaksa and Maithripala Sirisena. At present, following the election of Gotabaya Rajapaksa as president in 2019, the negative attitude towards devolution has intensified, with the president claiming that, and I quote, "There was no point wasting time on solutions that couldn't be implemented." So overall, the Sinhalese went from demanding federalism to now rejecting it. Now, with a historical understanding of the Sinhalese position, let's quickly look at the evolution of Tamil position on federalism. As you can see in the spectrum, in the past, it was the Tamils who rejected the idea of federalism. But from there, the Tamils have moved their stance on federalism to now espousing a federal solution within a united Sri Lanka. Now, in tracing the Tamil position, we can map it along 4 phases. Before independence, when the Sinhalese leaders were championing federalism, some of the Tamil leaders rejected federalism, saying that a federal system will actually create disunity among the different communities living in the country. Instead, the Tamil leaders, especially G.G. Ponnambalam, the leader of the main Tamil political party at that time, wanted communal representation in the form of 50-50, with 50% governance held by the Sinhalese and the other 50% of governance held by the minorities. Now, the British again disregarded these calls and provided independence in 1948. Now, what followed independence was the evolution of Tamil demands as a reaction to government's reported discriminatory policies. In 1948, within just a few months after gaining independence, the government enacted the Ceylon Citizenship Act that disenfranchised nearly 780,000 hill country Tamils. This, coupled with other grievances I explained before, such as the language policy, led to Tamil demands for federalism. The Federal Party, led by Chelvanayagam, actually championed calls for federalism with the creation of a federal union. But despite these calls to give self-governing authority within a united country, the government continued to embrace policies along ethno-religious lines and did not meet the expectations of the Tamil-speaking communities. Now, the passing of the 1972 constitution that continued the government's discriminatory policy on language and not providing adequate means of devolution really acted as the nail in the coffin for calls for separatism. There were two approaches to demand separatism. Politically, some of the main Tamil-speaking political parties in 1976 jointly formed the Tamil United Liberation Front, the TULF, and adopted the Vattukotte resolution, which called for the creation of a free, sovereign, secular socialist state of Tamil Eelam. Now, the public support for a separate state at that time was evident when the TULF contested the general election and secured overwhelming support for the separate nation within the Tamil-speaking regions. But this was strongly opposed by the Sinhalese. Now, while there was a political approach, some Tamils embraced a militant approach to demand a separate state. The 1970s and 80s really saw the creation of several militant groups that demanded a separate state. From among them, the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, emerged as the strongest and most brutal group among them that often resorted to terrorist tactics to gain a separate state. They actually demanded a separate state till their defeat in 2009. Now, during the armed conflicts, demands for devolution got kind of overshadowed by the conflict that was happening around. But following the end of the war, the Tamil National Alliance, the main Tamil political party representing the interest of the Tamils in the north and east, reiterated Tamils' calls for regional self-rule through a devolution mechanism within a united Sri Lanka. Now, if you overlay the Sinhalese and Tamil positions on federalism, we can see how the two communities, Tamils and Sinhalese, shifted their views on federalism. The Sinhalese went from championing it to rejecting it, while Tamils went from rejecting it to championing it. Now that we have unpacked the historic evolution of federalism, let's look at unpacking the current conception of federalism. These two can be unpacked along the views embraced by the Sinhalese and Tamils on federalism. On the one hand, if you take the Tamils, most of them subscribe to a positive conception of federalism. We see Tamil politicians proposing the meaningful distribution of power from the center through the devolution of power as means of through a federal solution to the problems faced by the Tamil-speaking communities. They really perceive federalism as the means to run their own affairs at a regional level within a united Sri Lanka. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the Sinhalese, most of them subscribe to a negative conception of federalism. We see some Sinhalese rejecting federalism as paving the way for the formation of a separate state or a precursor to separatism itself. This is widely viewed as posing a threat to the country's national sovereignty. Most of their thinking is really shaped by a misconception that federalism will divide the country. This largely, I think, stems from negative historical experiences and the steps that led to it, including Tamil's calls for separatism. At present, this manifests in some form with some Sinhalese politicians and parties rejecting federalism and the devolution of power and calling for the concentration of power in the central government. So let me end my presentation here and open the floor for questions. And before I hand it to Tia, let me actually reiterate that what I presented is only a snapshot on federalism in Sri Lanka. A thorough understanding of federalism requires a more in-depth study altogether. Regardless of it, I look forward to answering some of your questions on my article in the sections that follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rochelle, for this interesting presentation and for this snapshot view on the development and also the conceptions on federalism in Sri Lanka. I would now like to invite you, the audience, to ask some questions to our guest speaker, Rochelle, regarding the case of Sri Lanka, and please do so in the Q&A box that you can see on your screen. Maybe in the meantime, I will allow myself to break the ice a little bit with some questions of ourselves from Søren and me that we came up with when we were reading your paper and also now listening to your presentation. And I would like to maybe quickly ask a question first regarding your last point that you raised in relation to the misconception of federalism, that federalism and devolution are actually synonyms to secession almost. And I would like to ask you, what do you think, in your opinion, what would actually be needed, both on the political level, but then also on the level of the civil society, to overcome this misconception and maybe have a more less influenced view on what federalism and devolution could actually mean for Sri Lanka?
I think that's a really good question. Perhaps we can think of two ways to overcome this misconception. One, however much we try to distance ourselves from a politician-led discourse, often in Sri Lanka, a shift in politically driven discourse tends to have a significant impact in how the society views certain issues. One of the recent examples of this was when the president invited the Tamil diaspora community to negotiate and discuss possible solutions to the country's issues. Now, usually the government tend to reject the Tamil diaspora as worsening the country's issues. But following a shift in the president's stance, it was actually welcomed by a significant segment of the society. So in the same way, if perhaps the political leaders themselves, especially some of the moderate Sinhalese politicians, can lead this discussion, it may perhaps change public opinion on federalism. Second is definitely increasing public awareness on the concept of federalism, including possible debunking of misconceptions associated with federalism. This can be done both through the support of civil society actors and even politicians themselves. One of the main ways this could happen is through the media. Now, the media in Sri Lanka plays a significant role in shaping a person's attitude towards an issue. In such a situation, if the media could raise awareness on the real history and the real applicability of federalism, people might be more aware to critically think and understand federalism for themselves. Another possible way to introduce is to actually introduce the concept of federalism and its origins in Sri Lanka's history textbooks or the public school curriculum. Often our history textbooks in the country, they themselves omit certain histories and distorts history. So if you actually go through our history textbooks, especially all the primary school education, with 1948, most of our history ends there. We do not actually go beyond it to discuss it. So perhaps introducing such histories of our own past could perhaps empower the youth, the future generation, with more awareness on federalism. And that might be a good way to avoid this misconception.
Do you actually think that on one of your slides you showed very well, or in your last slide, you actually showed very well how the view on federalism went in counter directions by both ethnic groups? Do you actually think there is now a room for a common position? And maybe, I don't know if you can answer that question, but do you think what could such a common position actually look like, both from the Sinhalese position and the Tamil position?
Okay, so that's the million-dollar question I think all the politicians in Sri Lanka have been trying to answer. Yes, I personally subscribe and believe that we could negotiate and reach a common consensus on meaningful devolution. After all, democracy functions well if there's real discussions and debates among the different communities, right? Over time, we have tried this approach of a middle path on federalism, and we have our past historical references ever since independence to show this. We had in the 1950s and 1960s, we had the Tamil political leader, Selvanayagam, and the prime minister of that time signing pacts. Then we have the Indolanka Accord that paved way for the 13th Amendment that offered a limited devolution. While some of its components are implemented, some others are still yet to be implemented. even during the previous government, we almost reached a common consensus on how a new constitution should look like. And that offered some form of devolution. But due to the failure in discussions and the change in government, that also stopped. But what is important from that previous constitution, and I think I have the quote somewhere with me, Sri Lanka is a free, sovereign and independent republic, which is an Ekiya Rajya or Orumitha Nadu in our local languages, consisting of the center and of the provinces, and that which shall exercise power as laid down in the constitution. And this article, Ekiya Rajya or Orumitha Nadu, means a state which is undivided and indivisible. So these two are very important factors for our Sri Lankan polity to understand that federalism will actually not lead to a separate, to totally divide the country. Right now, we have actually resumed discussions on creating a new constitution. Even the current government, which came to power in 2019, promised to bring in a new constitution. Last week, too, our president reiterated this message that we will usher in a new constitution. So perhaps this discussion is very timely in the sense that perhaps going beyond it, we could recommence discussions with different stakeholders in approaching this devolutionary mechanism that might work for Sri Lanka.
With regards to the existing instruments on devolution, you mentioned the Indolanka Accord, and that led to the 13th Amendment. And there is also a question from the audience in regards to the provincial councils that are mentioned in the 13th Amendment. Can you maybe explain a little bit more what the role of the provincial councils actually is, what kind of powers that they have? You mentioned in your presentation that land powers and police powers have not actually been implemented. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on what their actual role actually is at the moment, and also what it should be according to the 13th Amendment.
Sure, that's a great question as well. So the 13th Amendment basically established provincial councils in Sri Lanka and provided for devolution. But the implementation of the 13th Amendment, as I said earlier, actually needs to be weighted against genuine power sharing. Although in the 9th schedule of the Constitution, power in respect to many subjects has been devolved to the provincial councils. We, if I remember correctly, we have nearly 37 functions such as land, police power, agriculture, education, health, local government, and even social services. But despite having all these, the parliament has the power to override the council using 2/3 majority. So by saying that they are proposing national policies, parliament has at times legislated on subjects and functions in the 9th schedule. Historically, we have seen the central government restricting powers of the provinces as well, especially in relation to police powers and land powers, which they claim could come under the ambit or the larger ambit of national security altogether. So overall, while the provincial councils in theory do provide for devolution, the implementation of it remains questionable in my view. And in recent times, another major issue with the provincial councils is that we have not held provincial council elections for some time right now. The terms of office, it's a nearly 5-year period, and all the 9 provinces in our country's tenure actually expired in 2019. While the provincial council elections are not yet held, the powers to govern the provinces are exercised by the governor, who is directly appointed by the president. So some view this as a threat to democracy itself and as a way of like executive overreach, going beyond from the central itself. So most recently, even this Indian Foreign Secretary who visited Sri Lanka reiterated these calls to the government to hold the provincial elections at the earliest opportunity. So that's where we stand at the provincial council systems.
Before I ask another question from the audience, I will very quickly ask about India's role in this whole development. You just mentioned again India's role. India had a role in the discussion on federalism in Sri Lanka. Can you maybe explain a little bit what India's role is at the moment, if there still is any, or also if there is any other external actors that influence the discussion on federalism in Sri Lanka too?
Sure. So India is perhaps the main actor in the region that has had a significant impact on issues of federalism and devolution in Sri Lanka. Often whenever Sri Lankan government actors go for bilateral meetings, or when Indian actors come to Sri Lanka, often this issue of devolution almost always comes up, and they have remained consistent on this. Ever since the signing of the Indolanka Accord in 1976 and the passing of the 13th Amendment, India has reiterated these calls to fully implement its provisions, leading to effective devolution. Most recently, again, when the Indian Foreign Secretary Harsh Shringla visited Sri Lanka also, he reiterated this call. Now, we need to understand India's role in the context of the dual stance that Sri Lankans normally hold to external actors and even India in specific. On the one hand, we actually view them as one of our closest allies based on our neighboring position and their assistance. On the other hand, we also view them with suspicion a bit. Some of the ways this suspicion manifests is on discussions on federalism, when some politicians in Sri Lanka reject the 13th Amendment as a product of external interference in Sri Lanka's domestic affairs. Usually external interference is seen as like hurting Sri Lanka's dignity and reputation. So overall, we have India reiterating their calls for devolution and some political actors within Sri Lanka rejecting India's alleged interference in Sri Lankan affairs. So that's where we stand with the Indian relation.
Thank you. There is one question from the audience with regards to the reason as to why Sri Lanka, or the chances that could there be for Sri Lanka to become a federal state. And the person is asking if there's also an economic case for federalism. Is there a reason, or is there a reason to promote economic diversity throughout the country, and also a need to decentralize economic decision making? Could you say something on that?
Yes, most certainly. So these two debates actually go hand in hand in terms of development as well as the devolution and minority related rights. So in terms of economic reasoning and the background to it, there's a disparity in terms of how funds are allocated and how development occurs across different provinces. That also results in the GDP disparities that we see. For example, the Monaragala province, or sorry, the Uva province might not get the same funds as the northern province or even the southern province. So that creates some form of disparity between the provinces themselves. And this perhaps is also something that could be potentially solved if we have like a proper devolved structure, especially in the functioning of the provincial council itself. Once we have our elections, that might perhaps be an added thing for us to think through as well, in terms of economically sustaining the whole, equally sustaining the whole province, like the country.
Can you give I am sorry. Yeah, there was a question. I'm sorry. There was a question also from the audience regarding the political decision makers at the moment. And can you maybe tell us what the current political elite's attitude is towards federalism? Maybe from both sides as well, both the Tamil and the Sinhalese leaders. What is the current debate at the moment? You mentioned before there is actually discussion regarding potentially developing a new or drafting a new constitution. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
So largely this depends on, like, this stems from this misconception still among some of the Sinhalese politicians that have a greater appeal within society, especially the Sinhalese society. This misconception, they advance this misconception that federalism will lead to a divided country. So that misconception still remains, and that has a bearing on how political elites themselves view federalism. But on the other hand, the Tamil political side again has views that they still continue to reiterate that federalism is the solution for our problems, the grievances of the Tamil community. Reaching a moderate position on it might be giving devolution as mechanisms. But in terms of the political elites at the moment, it goes just on the sides of both the communities. Both of them have their own conceptions of it. And as I explained in my article as well, we still continue to have that conception. It's that we need to break this misconception and bring the two forces together, I say.
We've now talked about the Tamil and the Sinhalese view on the issue. However, in the beginning of your presentation, you also mentioned that it is a multi-ethnic and multi-religious country. There are also other major communities in Sri Lanka, specifically the Muslims and hill country Tamils, for instance. Do these communities actually also take part in the discussions on federalism in the country?
That's again a really good question. If you recall during my presentation, I kept referring to the Tamil position, especially in the first three phases of Tamil speaking communities. The reason for this is that up until the 1970s and 1980s, we had all these three groups, Muslims, Hill Country Tamils, and the Sri Lankan Tamils, all united along linguistic lines under a common banner of a Tamil speaking communities themselves. So when the Tamil political parties demanded federalism in the 1950s, it also represented the interests of the Muslims and the Hill Country Tamils to a large extent. So if you recall, when we had in 1948, when the Citizenship Act came along, it was the Tamil speaking party, the federal party, that demanded, okay, we need autonomy right now because you all are all, the government is disenfranchising the Hill Country Tamils. However, having said this, that along ethno-linguistic lines they have been together, however, this position changed in the 1980s. In the 1980s, we saw the emergence of the Sri Lanka Muslim Congress, representing the interests of the Muslims solely. Similarly, while Pondaman's Ceylon Workers' Congress, party representing the Hill Country Tamils, initially it was part of the Tamil United Liberation Front, but when the TULF demanded separatism, the Ceylon Workers' Congress stepped out of the coalition. Since then, we have witnessed some discussions, actually, especially among the Muslim community on devolution, with the creation of a Muslim self-governing region in the east of the country, which has a significant population in the towns of Ampara and Kalmuni. Yet the Muslim position on federalism remains marginal and not as animated as the Sinhalese and Tamil positions due to our history, with how the Tamil-speaking communities encompassed all these communities in the past. And it's an emerging thing. Definitely it will contribute towards the future discussions.
Can you maybe tell a little bit more about the conceptions of, for instance, the Muslim group? You now said it's marginal. What do they bring actually additional conceptions on federalism to the table, or not very much?
They do, in the sense that they do also want to have self-governing authorities or regions in within their self-regional control. However, it has not yet manifested in the forms of direct demands for autonomy. So they do have a conception of it, and if I were to say it in this way, it tallies somewhat with the Tamil position, but at present it hasn't manifested into a huge debate or political discussion.
Maybe if we go a little bit more into the smaller entities, the 13th Amendment actually also mentions local governments. We have not talked about the role of local governments yet. Could you maybe explain a little bit whether or not that part of the 13th Amendment has been implemented, and if yes, what role local governments play in the political system of Sri Lanka?
Sure. So the local governance, that aspect of the 9th schedule, is actually embodied by the local government bodies that we have in the country. So we have the municipal council, the urban councils, and the Pradesh Sabhas, which are kind of subsets of devolution in Sri Lanka, going beyond the provincial councils. They largely derive powers based on existing ordinance and laws. For example, we have the provincial council ordinance, the municipal council ordinance that confer powers to them, empower them. They're more on a very local, domesticated regional level than the provincial councils. While the provincial councils manages a large extent, the divisional local government bodies such as the municipal council, the urban councils, and Pradesh Sabhas manage the locality of their region. The provincial councils are open to confer additional powers to these bodies, but are not empowered to take away their powers on the other hand. So you can give more additional powers, but not remove their local government bodies' powers.
There's been another question that maybe relates a little bit to one of my first questions, and that is, we've now talked about the political elites, we've talked about the leaders, we've talked about, you've also talked about in your presentation about the stance of the military elite. The question is there also a federal debate in the world of academia and politics, and is federalism actually also discussed on the streets, or is that really just a discussion that that is held among the political, academic, or also military elites?
So in large part, I would say the concept of federalism is discussed along the political lines, but that's not to say that people in the streets don't talk about it, especially during elections. Federalism is a way of galvanizing support, so public support. So during those times, we can actually see people talking on the streets as well. They are going to divide the country. No, that will solve our problems. In that sense, we do have discussions happening that way. But most of the discussions normally tend to stem within the political side, the politicians themselves who represent the people's mandate. And in addition to that, we have academics, think tanks, and even civil society actors and NGOs discussing these issues in the society.
I do have a question that is more geopolitical, in that I do hope that you are ready to answer, because someone from the audience asked, what could the role be of Sri Lanka in a new system of changing world powers? And if Sri Lanka turns more and more to the Chinese side, in parentheses, what about Hambantota? And or could Sri Lanka be more part or associated member of the newly installed AUKUS treatment? If you can, I have never heard about that treatment or treaty, but maybe if you do, maybe you could explain a little bit and respond to that question from the audience.
That's a really interesting question, and at the same time, it's a really tough question for me to answer based on my own expertise, just focusing on local concepts of federalism itself. But perhaps Sri Lanka is situated in the crossroads of a geopolitical situation. We have India on the one hand, we have the US and the Western countries on the other hand, and on the other side of the whole spectrum, we also have China and East Asian politics. So we are situated in the crossroads of all of these geopolitical securities. Usually within the Sri Lankan mindset, when we try to unpack it, at least within the Singhalese position, we see a kind of insecurity to do with the Western powers and even India. For example, what I said with the Indolanka Accords and the Indian involvement, we see them at times as external interference. Whereas China, on the other hand, we tend not to go all the way to like rejecting them. So in this discussion, I would say federalism has not yet emerged as a huge political debate in the country. But of course, outside federalism and in general politics and general society discussions, these geopolitical actors do tend to come into play. And that is where, it doesn't have to be Hambantota. The recent, Colombo Port City is one other example which has some kind of Chinese influence. Then we have the Keravalapitia power station with the American influence, and the Trincomalee oil tanks with the Indian influence. So we have quite a lot of geopolitical insecurity in that sense. Can
you explain quickly what is meant by Hambantota? Is that also a port, or?
Yes, it's a port located in the southern province of our country.
Do these global powers actually influence internal discussions? And like what you mentioned, or what we talked about before about India influencing the federal debate in the past, is China involved in any sort of constitutional discussions in Sri Lanka with regards to federalism or the constitutional development in other fields?
So if my history and my memory, like if I could recollect on those, on the one hand, definitely India is the major player that has directly got involved. In addition to that, we have Norway, which actually mediated a ceasefire agreement between the LTTE and the government back then. These two actors did influence in some ways, in the sense of like talking about reaching a common consensus on these power sharing mechanisms. In addition to this, perhaps the UNHRC's role in Sri Lanka, especially in post-war Sri Lanka, has some kind of an influence, I would say, not interference, more than influence, where they promote seeking accountability, transitional justice, and even mechanisms to devolve power and share power. So from that sense, perhaps, yes, we do have certain influences in terms of constitutional debates, but not directly into forming our own constitution and stuff like that at the moment.
I do have a rather sensitive question from the audience as well, and that the person asks if federalism could rectify the ills brought by political dynasties as prevalent in Asia. I assume federalism is discussed in many countries in Asia. Do you think that federalism could actually calm the discussion in regards to the ills that were brought by colonialism and other ills?
Thinking back on history, perhaps soon after independence, I mean, just before reaching independence, we could have potentially gone to some form of discussion like this. I think in my mind, the case that comes to my mind is India. So Indian constitution was actually drafted by the Indians themselves soon after gaining independence. In the Sri Lankan case, it was actually drafted in the UK and actually was passed in the UK parliament as well, not in Sri Lanka, the 1948 constitution. So perhaps in that sense, it could have changed the political trajectory that we are at present. But going beyond that, federalism can be one of the biggest solutions that the country has to solve the internal grievances that we have, especially considering the Asian context.
We've circled the topic a few times now, and that has also to do with the question from the audience just before, why Sri Lanka should actually become federalism, or what chances there lie with Sri Lanka federalizing or having more decentralization and devolution. And can we maybe quickly talk about what reasons there are? So we've talked about ethnic reasons, we've talked about linguistic conflicts that could be solved, we've talked about the economic development that could also be addressed with federalism. Is there any other reason that you can think of as to why federalism could be a chance for Sri Lanka?
I think you actually captured all what I had in mind. So the 3 or 4 ambits through which we can see this. One is to look at it through an ethnic perspective, to solve the ethno-linguistic grievances that our country has faced. Second is to actually look through development angle and how that could affect how we see federalism itself. So those 2 really capture the larger federalism debates that we have seen. And that's up to the knowledge that I have already gained so far. So we need to do more in-depth study to really understand federalism more in that sense, to see the advantages and possible future trajectories that we can have.
And maybe as a almost last question, how do you actually see Sri Lanka's future federalism? What do you have in mind? Would you draw the lines at the ethnic borders, or would you have a different concept of federalism in mind for Sri Lanka's futures, and what kind of caveats would you see?
So personally, for me, a devolutionary mechanism of some sort would be an ideal solution for the country. So right now we are in the stage where we have certain aspects. So the 13th Amendment and the provincial council system do guarantee these things in theory. So perhaps we start from there, where we have decentralizations commencing from there. And then if it's fully implemented, we can really go into thinking about a new constitution altogether to discuss the possible provisions that could be brought to make a federal state. But going at the moment, from my own personal experience, I would say devolution, fully sharing and providing meaningful distribution of power. That is the way to go forward.
So you would actually say, if I understand you correctly, that we need functioning decentralization before we can discuss federalism in the country. Do you understand it more as like a step-by-step process? Or the question also from the audience was, does Sri Lanka need a big bang rather than a step-by-step process?
So I would say taking it slow with a step-by-step process would be ideal, especially considering that there are a lot of misconceptions of federalism itself. So breaking the whole chain would be to first start with public awareness on the positives and even weighing it out to say, look, federalism does not lead to a divided state or a divided country. So that's the start. And then we go on to actually implementing decentralization mechanisms. Just implement what we have in the country. And from there, we can look towards other possible ventures. But for now, I would say taking it step by step is the ideal position.
When you do your research on federalism in the context of Sri Lanka, do you actually also look at other countries' systems? Is there systems from other federal states or highly decentralized states that would, in your opinion, be quite suitable to the case of Sri Lanka? Or would you say more like a puzzle system, and there is aspects of many different systems that could be adapted?
So within, when I did my research, actually, I came across some interesting anecdotes. For example, if my memory serves me right, it was SWRD Bandaranaike back in the 1920s who actually envisioned Sri Lanka should be a federal state like Switzerland, where there's actually more devolution of power, like it's almost towards like a confederation, where the states and they have more power than the federal government itself. Since then, we have actually looked up to, I think, India as an example, where they have union territories and the provinces, and there's also asymmetrical federalism in Jammu and Kashmir. So these are some of the avenues we have actually looked at in our own past histories. But for my particular article, I just looked into Sri Lankan context and limited myself there. I did not go do a comparative study in other countries.
I think we do still have time for some more questions. There was a question from the audience with regards to the multi-ethnic character of Sri Lanka. And I think the person is asking in relation to the importance of ethnicity to the young. I'm just going to read the question. Maybe that is easier. Given the multi-ethnic character of the country, do you see the people jettison sectional loyalty for national loyalty? So having prioritizing loyalty to their ethnic group over national loyalty.
So ever since independence, we have tended to have that debate. Since 1948, I think I would say there was an emergence of the Sinhala Buddhist identity. And in the same way, we had among the Tamils as well, Tamil-speaking communities and the Tamil identity that emerged. Overall, that again needs to be reformed in the political mind, that we don't stick only to the being patriotic does not mean you have to adhere to your own ethnic nationality or ethnic identity. Rather thinking of it through a perspective of Sri Lankans without going along Sri Lankan Tamil, Hindu, without that kind of a barrier. That's in an ideal society, that would be the end goal.
I do think that we come to the end of the discussion, and we have talked about how to actually overcome the misconceptions of federalism. How you would envision a federal Sri Lanka. But as a final question, maybe you could tell me a little bit, what do you think actually the immediate next step? What time frame do you also see for a reform process? I know you're smiling, and I think it is a very difficult question, but what do you think is actually the most urgent thing that would have to be done in regards to reforming?
So considering that we are back at negotiating tables to form a new constitution, perhaps within the next few months, even 1 or 2 years, we could mobilize more awareness on this whole issue of misconception. And from there, we could perhaps go into forming the constitution itself, which might have, it should be inclusive of all actors, be it Tamil, be it Sinhalese, from regional levels to all the way up to the provinces. So based on that, I would say the time frame is going to be really hard for me to explain, because it doesn't, like, Rome was not built over one night. It took a long time. So similarly, I think this whole process of federalizing the country, or even bringing a constitution that has devolution, might take some time. And we have already initiated conversations. So if you look at all the governments, all of them had some form of thing to do with devolution. So perhaps we start from there and then go and see about the new processes that we could potentially take.
Thank you very much. I do think that is a good way to end this discussion today. And I think we are ready to conclude this session. It was very interesting to listen to you, to hear your presentation, and also to hear your answers that were much broader in the end than just focusing on the initial topics that we started. And I think we had quite an interesting journey here together. So I would like to thank you very much, Rochelle Kanakasabe, for your presentation, for being here, for participating, for your paper, and would like to thank you for that. Our next seminar to the audience will take place on the 16th of November at the usual time that we normally have this webinar. And we will then discuss a paper on the topic of minority rights. You will receive the invitation on the usual, on our usual paths. So it will be very nice if you joined us again, and if you had a lot of questions that you could pose there as well. I would also like to mention that this and all the previous events are available on the website of the Hans Seidel Foundation, and you can also watch the events on YouTube. And this now leaves me to thank you again, Rochelle, for your presentation. And if you have any feedback from the audience, there will not be, maybe some of you have been here before, and sometimes there was a survey. This time there won't be a survey, but of course we're always very happy to receive feedback, and we appreciate if you let us know either way if you do have any. So depending on where you are right now, I wish you a very good night, a good afternoon, or a good morning, and see you next time. Goodbye.